Well, welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast once again, and I'm so delighted to have my friend Gabe Gordon with me again. We did a podcast episode about a little over a year ago, I think in March of 2025. And Gabe is a Jewish Christian, and he has this neat intersectionality between Christianity and Judaism, and sees them together in a way that I really love. And we spoke last time about his book, The Fundamentals of a Recovering Fundamentalist, and we did that podcast episode. And then we hinted a little bit about supersessionism, but this time we want to do a deep dive. Supersessionism and the misuse of the Hebrew Bible is a major theme of Gabe's work, and he's going to explore it in greater detail. I've spoken a lot about replacement theology and a bit about supersessionism in previous episodes, particularly my episode from last year, Season 1, Episode 56 from August 2nd, 2025, and it was about the harm of replacement theology in Hebrews 8, 6 through 13. So welcome, Gabe. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's always great to be back on the podcast. Always great to be back here in the great state of Washington and to see my old seminary friend. So.
I'm so glad when you make it out here. So we take advantage of that. We take advantage of Gabe when he's here. I just wanted to ask you to briefly introduce yourself. I mean, people who've been watching me know a bit about who you are, but if you could just briefly say who you are and your point of view and where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, my name is Gabe Gordon. I am a Jewish Christian, as Rob mentioned. I attend both a conservative synagogue and an Episcopal Anglican church. I'm an author. I've published and written 3 books. I'm currently working on 3 other books. I've been getting into opinion piece writing recently. I have degrees in biblical studies and historical theology, studying the early church, specifically early Greek and Syriac Christianity, and I do a lot of constructive Jewish Christian theology and focusing on, especially right now, on antisemitism and replacement theology.
And to me, it's so relevant today because, as you know, first of all, we have to get along with our neighbors in today's world, and there's so many, Christian Zionists and people using Israel for their own purposes and the conflict in Israel. But for me, what really turned me on to this a lot was I spoke to Beverly Gaventa a couple weeks ago, and we talked about Romans 9 through 11 and how that really is a pivot point in Romans. And as I studied it more and more, I just realized, oh my goodness, we are so supersessionist in our theologies, our Christian theologies. And so I would like to start, if you could define supersessionism sort of maybe in a broad way and maybe a couple of details about it. And then we'll talk about replacement theology. Okay.
Yeah, so just to start off to begin with, replacement theology and supersessionism are really, we're talking about the same thing. Supersessionism is a more academic way of talking about it. Replacement theology is kind of more the layperson way of speaking about it. Basically, it's the idea that the people of Israel, i.e. the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that we were at once the covenant people of God. We had the promises of the land. We had the promise, all the promises that were entailed in the covenant. And then after the coming of Jesus, or as I would say Yeshua, the covenant with Israel was ended, and it was now transferred over to the Gentile church. The Gentile church now replaces or supersedes the people of Israel, and all the promises in the covenant actually transfer over to the people of to the Gentile church. So that's the basic notion, right, of replacement theology or supersessionism. One of the things I do want to mention, one, is that there are 3 kinds of replacement theology according to Kendall Sulin, and I'll mention that in a brief moment. But I also want to relate how supersessionism relates to anti-Semitism, because oftentimes these are discussed as if they're maybe overlapping but distinct items. And I think that's actually problematic. And before I say why, I want to briefly say that when I actually use the term anti-Jewish racism more than I do anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism, the way it's used, is often distinguished as if it's not racism, as if it's its own bigotry, and it actually is racism. So I prefer the term anti-Jewish racism, but anti-Jewish racism and supersessionism, I would say, are not clearly distinct items. Because the way supersessionism works is it takes the Jewish people and then it puts them in a hierarchy, a social hierarchy of people, a people hierarchy. And it puts them at the bottom. They are barred from salvation. They're barred from the covenant. They're excluded from the ways of God. And every other people group represented in the Gentile church is at the top. So it actually is inherently a racial hierarchy. And therefore, supersessionism is an inherently racist way to categorize the Jewish people in relationship to every other people in the world. So in that sense, I don't want to distinguish supersessionism from racism, right? It is a kind of racism. And I think, there are scholars that have actually traced modern forms of racism, anti-black racism and so forth, back to supersessionism. So, and now, discussing kind of the three kinds of supersessionism that Kendall Sulin mentions is economic supersessionism, punitive supersessionism, and structural supersessionism. So punitive supersessionism is the idea that is the false idea that the Jews killed Jesus. It was actually the Romans, and the Nicene Creed actually says this, but that they killed Jesus, and because they killed Jesus, God is punishing them, and their punishment is to be excluded from the covenant, to have the covenant given to the Gentile church, and to be kicked out of the land of Israel, to wander perpetually forever. That's punitive supersessionism. Then there's economic supersessionism, which is the idea that Israel, as the people of God, as having his covenant with Israel, was only a momentary thing. It was always meant to be momentary, for a season, for a time, and eventually they were no longer going to be people of God. The covenant had an expiration date, essentially, when Jesus came. That's economic. And then structural supersessionism is sin by omission rather than commission. So if, for instance, if you're sharing the gospel story and you start with the creation of the world, and then you skip over the entire story of Israel and you get to the incarnation, that's structural supersessionism, leaving out the story of Israel and Christian theology from the context of that story, and as part of that story is what structural supersessionism is. So the Nicene Creed, for instance, is not supersessionist in what it says, but it's supersessionist in the fact that it skips over the entire story of Israel. So, and that's probably like some of the Markian influences in the early church, right? Is that a complete rejection of Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, and so forth. Even though that was, opposed, we still have a lot of that still in us, right? Because we have Christians today that just ignore the Hebrew Bible unless they want to use it for stories or whatever. We certainly have modern day Marcionites.
I
think what was it? Who was the evangelical pastor that a few years ago said we shouldn't read the Old Testament?
The Old Testament at all?
Who was that?
I don't know.
I don't remember who it was. Andy Stanley. It was Andy Stanley.
Okay.
So he and people called him out for being a Marcionite.
Right.
Rightfully so.
Well, I can remember when we were in seminary, we even had some, because the seminary we went to had quite a few charismatics in it, right? And I can remember some of them just really struggled with that, so you go, it's still with us a lot. I wanted to do two things. First of all, I wanted to quote Walter Brueggemann, which I think is always a good idea when you're talking about Old Testament, and his view of supersessionism, especially related to how the book of Hebrews is used for supersessionism so much, and then talked about John Goldengay, who is was a I don't know if he's an emeritus yet, but he was at Fuller for a really long time. Great scholar too. And they both, and you would say, well, Brueggemann you can kind of understand, right? Because Brueggemann isn't super evangelical, but Goldengay was, or is. So you could say, even between these two guys, they get it. So Walter Brueggemann said in Jeremiah, about Jeremiah, especially Jeremiah 31, which is the idea of the new covenant, the first time we hear about the new covenant. And he says, thus we arrive at a profound tension between the Old Testament text and a New Testament quotation, because Jeremiah 31, 33, I think it is, 31 and 33 through 33 is quoted verbatim in Hebrews 8. And he goes, a tension reflective of a long history of Jewish-Christian competitive acrimony. He says, the matter is not easily adjudicated because the supersessionist, now remember when he says supersessionist, what he means, what Gabe just said, case is given scriptural warrant in the book of Hebrews. At best, Christians come derivatively and belatedly to share the promised newness of the new covenant. And so I wonder if you had any comments about that. It's just that, I mean, obviously Brueggemann's being quite critical of Christian supersessionism.
I think Jeremiah 31 is misused. I don't when it says a new covenant, how I understand that is a renewed covenant. It's not a new covenant. I don't think there is an old covenant and a new covenant. I think there's one covenant, the covenant that God makes with Israel, and the Gentiles are grafted into that and benefit from that. But the Jews are not replaced, and there's not two covenants. And so the way I understand Jeremiah 31 is not that, again, that there's a new covenant, but that it's being renewed. And we see this throughout the scriptures, is the covenant always gets renewed, right? And so it's not as if there's a new covenant.
Yeah, maybe we have Noah, we have Moses, we have David.
And I would add that when we're reading passages like Hebrews 8, which can be a difficult passage, I think we need to take a cue from the New Testament authors themselves, right? From the apostles and from Yeshua or Jesus. Is in my friend Jerome Boll, who's the head of the Jules Isaac Foundation, which is a post-supersessionist organization. He makes the compelling case that the Old Testament actually has exegetical priority.
Okay.
That we're not supposed to read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament.
Yes.
As we're told, oftentimes. But we're supposed to read the New Testament in light of the Old Testament.
Yes.
And this is how Jesus reads the Old Testament.
And Paul.
Right? And Paul. And all the New Testament authors.
Yes.
They're all reading about Jesus and his ministry and trying to understand him in the light of the Old Testament as the lens, as the interpretive lens. And so when we begin from reading the New Testament backwards, we're actually reading the Bible in a way that the New Testament authors themselves don't.
Yes.
So I think that's important, and that can lead to a supersessionist way of reading the scriptures. So when we're reading Jeremiah 31 and the rest of the Old Testament should actually serve as a priority in our interpretive lens for reading books like Hebrews.
In fact, that came very clear to me in interviewing Beverly Gavena, is that this idea of that Paul gets used for a supersessionist project a lot of times, and that when you really understand where Paul is talking about very physical reality in his time, you can't come to the conclusions that we often do. Especially things like the Hilasterion in Romans 3, when you get to Romans 11, where it says, does God reject the Israel? And of course not, you know. Okay.
And can I just add one thing to that?
Sure.
So we're talking about Jeremiah 31 and Paul and Romans, right? Paul says explicitly, I think it's in chapter 9, he says that the covenant is actually with Israel is irrevocable.
Yes, he does. Yes,
what God gives, God cannot take back. And this is actually testified to in Jeremiah 31, that same passage, right? The talks that people often use as a way to say, well, there was an old covenant, now there's a new covenant that God is superseding the old covenant with. But in verses 36 and 37, it says, the Lord affirms, the descendants of Israel will not cease forever to be a nation in my sight. That could only happen if the fixed ordering of the heavenly lights were to cease to operate before me. The Lord says, I will not reject all the descendants of Israel because of all that they have done. That could only happen if the heavens above could be measured or the foundations of the earth below be explored, says the Lord. So this idea that I can never reject Israel. And this is the character of God that we see throughout, right? In 2 Timothy, it says, when we are faithless, God remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. Right?
Well, in fact, 2 Timothy is a great example. 2 Timothy 3, where people use that often, 3:16, to say inerrancy of Scripture. What they're actually talking about is giving Timothy, who's half Jewish, the permission to use the Hebrew Scriptures. And the permission to act rabbinically, and rabbinically wasn't the word, but act,
proto-rabbinically,
proto-rabbinically before the rabbis, but to speak on behalf of Judaism to Gentiles, and they go, that's not a. If you think replacement, you're just going to say, well, Timothy doesn't care.
But clearly he does, because what does Timothy's Judaism used to be traced through the father side, and that's clear and actually still in the New Testament. So when Paul, Timothy's mother was actually a Gentile, his father was Jewish,
right?
And so he hadn't been circumcised,
right?
Actually, it was the other way around. The mother was Jewish, the father was a Gentile, but he hadn't been circumcised, and so Paul takes him and he circumcises him, right? So clearly, it's still important to Timothy and to Paul, and I would say it's still clearly important to Timothy because he agrees to be circumcised as an adult.
Yes,
which is not an easy undertaking. So
right, exactly, kind of echoes of Galatians there, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll move on to John Goldengay. He says that the new covenant is established by God's action of forgiveness and renewal, as we see in Jeremiah. And the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament, including the New Covenant, are not nullified or replaced by the New Testament, but are fulfilled in a way that includes both Jews and Gentiles. This is an evangelical, quite, from Fuller, which, some people don't think is very conservative, but it was and it has been. It's saying God's path or God's purpose is to redeem people, not just elect Gentiles, right? So I loved that. So he goes, rather than replacements of progress that he's talking about, Goldengay sees Jeremiah 31:33 as a promise of a new covenant that deepens and expands the relationship between God and his people. So maybe that's one way I would add, is that the new covenant is an expansion. So it's not a replacement. It's not, because some people will take, I forget where it is in Hebrews, where it says the old covenant has passed away. So maybe, do you have any comments about that?
I mean, my basic understanding of what's going on in Hebrews is the same crisis that's happening in the broader rabbinic world. So Yeshua, often gets contrasted with the rabbis, as if they're totally different people. But actually, who do you fight with the most? Do you fight with people the most that aren't in your denomination, or do you fight with people the most that are in your denomination, right? The people that you're closest to are oftentimes, like your family, for instance, are oftentimes the people that you fight with the most. Why is he fighting with the Pharisees so much? Because he's a Pharisee, right? Paul's a Pharisee. Yeshua's theology is Pharisaic. And the Pharisaic tradition is what becomes Rabbinic Judaism, which is the mainstream of Judaism today. And so, and if you compare Jesus to the first kind of written text, which is taking oral tradition from Jesus' time onward for the first 200 years of the Common Era, which is called the Mishnah. It's the first part of the Talmud. This is recording oral tradition, writing it down from Jesus' time and a couple hundred years afterwards. And if you compare that to the New Testament, to Jesus and the Gospels, it's actually...
There's a lot of overlap.
Because Jesus was a proto-Pharisee, or was a proto-rabbi in a sense. He was part of the tradition that ends up becoming Rabbinic Judaism. And so what's happening in Rabbinic Judaism after the temple, right? The Romans had colonized Israel. They had subjugated the Jewish people. And in 66 CE, the Jews revolt, right? And actually this wasn't the first revolt against colonial occupiers. This happened 200 years earlier with the Greeks, with the Maccabees. This is where the story of Hanukkah comes. The Greeks had ruled and were colonizing Israel. The Maccabees rise up and they kick them out. They rededicate the temple. So this is still kind of recent memory within the Jewish people, and God throughout the scriptures promises that he's going to restore them to the land. He's going to foreign occupiers will no longer rule over them. So this is still in their mind. So when the Romans are ruling over them in the first century, in 66, particularly when persecution gets bad, they rise up and rebel against the imperial conquestors, namely the Romans. Eventually the Romans win, and they crush the rebellion, and they destroy the temple in 70 CE. When that happens, because that was the center of the Jewish world, right? Jews from the diaspora from Spain, from Iran, from Egypt, and most Jews were in Israel still at that point, but there were still Jews in the diaspora, in exile, like Greece and Italy and so forth.
Yeah, Egypt.
In Egypt, yeah. And so so in Pentecost, when it says, this is one of my pet peeves, people often think that when Pentecost, all these people from the nations, they think, oh, those are Gentiles, that the tongues that fight. No, those are Jews.
No, yeah.
Those are Jews that live in exile in these various countries that come back to Israel, to Jerusalem, 3 times a year to go to the temple and to make sacrifices and celebrate the 3 major holidays. Now, so because of that, the temple is the center of Israel, the land of it. It's a symbol of the way of being Jewish and of worshiping God. And so when that's destroyed in 70 A.D., that is a major theological conundrum that now we have to figure out, how do we worship God, right? How do we find atonement? How do we worship God? Yeah. And so the rabbis are dealing with this. Yeah, right. And Hebrews is dealing with this.
Well, Roger Naum talked about that a little bit when I interviewed him, as he talked about it after 70 CE, very similar to the Second Temple period, and all of those years when they barely had an altar in Jerusalem until the Second Temple was actually built, was also one of those things, is they had to learn how to be Jewish and how to do the temple practices again, apart from the temple,
and so that's what the rabbis are dealing with, and that's what Talmud is kind of a response to. Some of these early rabbinic Jewish texts, and that's what I think Hebrews is responding. It's a Jewish Christian parallel to what the Pharisees are doing. How do we practice being Jewish, worshiping God? Because they were still Jews. They were still practicing circumcision. They were still eating kosher. They were still going to the temple. And so they were dealing with the same thing. So I think that's what Hebrews is dealing with. It's not that it's, I think it's a strong interpretation to say that they're rejecting the temple and the animal sacrifice. I don't think they are. I think they're saying they're being pragmatic. They're saying now that we can't do this, what do we do in lieu of this?
And we have and we have Jesus as our presence. Right.
And the rabbis in the Mishnah, how they deal with this is they say, well, there are 2 ways for atonement. There's the sacrifices in the temple, and there's deeds of loving kindness. So I think that's essentially what's going on in Hebrews, is a parallel conundrum that's happening in the Pharisaic world, that they're trying to figure out, how do we, now that the temple, we can't go to the temple, how do we do this?
I think it really helps this discussion when you realize that Hebrews was most likely written by highly educated Jews or Jewish person in Alexandria, far from after the destruction of the temple, trying to figure things out and one thing I always want people to understand, you see this in Paul and you see this in Hebrews as well, is that the distinction between Christian and Jew didn't exist in that era like we think it does, right? It was there wasn't this huge. There certainly were distinctions in practice, and that's what Galatians and Romans and others are about. But
between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of like we always look at these texts through 1,500 years of anti-Semitism,
that's right? Yeah.
Or supersessionism.
Yeah.
So, I think we should look at that, and so let's talk about then a couple ways in which this is used. I've had a lot of discussion. I often have a lot of discussion with, charismatics, Baptists, and people like that who tend to really believe in dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is Christianity to them, practically, right?
Left behind is their Bible.
Left behind is their Bible. Yeah. But not only that, I don't know if you were in the class with me. I was in a class, and it was the guest speaker was the pastor at the American Baptist Church in Beaverton, Village Baptist Church. Highly respected guy, and a good teacher and everything. But then he gets up in this class. It's a seminary class, right? I don't need dispensationalists in my class. He gets up there and he does like what I've seen many Baptists do.
Yeah.
He draws a line on the board.
Yeah.
And then he says, "Oh, here's Adam and Eve in the fall.
Yeah.
Here's the dispensation. He draws a cross in the middle of the diagram. Here's Jesus, and then dispensation, and then end times, right? And super linear, super Greek, mentality, linear thinking. And I was thinking, I go, even this guy, who I consider an intelligent, with it guy, just has dispensationalism so ingrained in him to think that that's what Christianity really is. But I think dispensationalism is ultra supersessionist.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do you have any feelings about that?
I'm not a huge fan of supersessionism. Yes, obviously supersession. I'm not a huge fan of dispensationalism. I do think you're right. This linear conception of time that they have is very Greek. And it's dispensationalism is a new idea, right? It comes from the early 19th century, I think the 1830s.
It's John Nelson Darby primarily.
So if you to me, if you can't, you can't find this throughout any of the tradition. It's a little hard pressed that it's not going to be in the scripture, that it's going to be in the scriptures, and everyone has gotten it wrong since then. I think that's a little bit arrogant. So. I don't know what else to say. It's a bat.
Well, dispensational is one dispensation replaces another dispensation.
Yes, yeah.
So it's kind of like replacement theology codified. In a timeline.
And it's for some Christian Zionists, dispensationalism is the reason why they're Christian Zionists, because they want all the Jews back in the land so that the Jesus will return, so that they can finish the dispensation, which is not all Christian Zionists.
No.
My friend Gerald McDermott, who's an Anglican priest and scholar, he has an edited volume called The New Christian Zionism, and in the preface he lambasts dispensationalism and says it's nonsense, right? And says that the majority of Zionism throughout Christian history has not been dispensationalist, right? So I think in some ways it's not even worth talking about dispensationalism because it's not biblical. It's not biblical, right. and it's just so absurd. There are better things to talk about, better things to argue with, in a sense.
I'll probably do an episode just on dispensationalism. Okay. I have done episodes on rapture theology, and rapture theology shows you how when you can take a few scriptures and shove them together to create what you want, and I just feel like that's what they do with this. That's where dispensationalism comes in, and I think they take Jeremiah 31, they take Hebrews, and they take Isaiah 53, they take Psalm 22, and they actually change the words in these. And to make it sound like they're talking about Jesus in Psalm 22, or they're talking about Jesus in Isaiah 53.
Which I do think they do, but I base that off of something very different from that. So I'd like to touch on that in a moment.
Okay, yeah.
But if you had a thought you wanted
I just wanted to, maybe that's a good question, is how can we look at those pieces of the Old Testament which we think are prophetic, or some people think are prophetic of Jesus? How do we look at that way in a non-supersessionist way?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with our conception of time, right? Do we think time is linear? So I wrote about this in a chapter that's going to be published hopefully in the next year or so, and it's this idea that, so in a Greek Western framework of time, there's past, present, and future, right? You draw a line, past, present, future.
You can even see it in the language.
Exactly. And that's part of the reason why I'm not an open theist, because they also have this linear conception of time, right? And I think that that's actually not biblical. And how I think essentially time works, and actually before I get into that, the problem with the linear conception of time is that it's supersessionist, or rather, it's what supersessionism is based on, right? Because supersessionism assumes there's a past in which an old revelation is given, and there's a present in which a new revelation is given, and there's a future in which a new reveation is given that replaces the old.
And then it's all going to be ended.
And actually, that's not entirely true. For Christian supersessionism, they think, God had this revelation and this revelation, that superseded the old. But this last one, that one's going to stay. That one's eternal. But the rest of them aren't eternal. And so it actually, that's what supersessionism relies on, is this linear conception of time. But what if time works differently in a way that actually makes supersessionism impossible? Yeah. So what I would say is that I believe in the timelessness of God. There is no time in God. Time is part of creation. This is part of the Rabbinic Judaism. This is part of the Gentile Christian tradition, that God is outside of time, and time itself is part of creation. It's what God creates. So when we see in the incarnation the bringing together of the Jewish humanity of the Messiah and the bringing together of the divinity of God, the divinity of God is without time. And is eternal, and the Jewish humanity of the Son is obviously with time. It is timeful, right? Yeah. So in the incarnation, time and eternity are actually united. Yes. And this affects how time works. So I make the argument that time is not linear, but that every moment of time that exists, both in the past and the future, are equally united to eternity because of the incarnation. Yeah. And therefore, because they're equally united to eternity, every moment of time is actually an equal distance to every other moment of time. So our moment of time right now is actually no farther from Jesus in the first century than 70 AD is from when Jesus was walking around in 33 AD. Like every moment is actually an equal distance from every other moment of time because it's connection to eternity. What this means is that because of the way that the time works, we can actually read the scriptures in a way that show that Yeshua is actually present throughout the story of Israel, right? So, for instance, the older manuscripts of Jude, the book of Jude, in the New Testament, say a really interesting note. They note that Jesus, not the pre-incarnate Word, but Jesus, the embodied incarnate Word, is the one that led Israel out of Egypt. Yeah. Paul says the rock that followed Israel around in the desert, that was Jesus. In Genesis 32, Jacob wrestles with somebody that is both a man and is God and has a body. Yeah. Because you can't wrestle with someone without a body. Right. Who could this be? Yeah. A divine man with a body. It has to be Jesus, right? So, but that can't work if time is linear. But if time is not linear, then we can actually look at each moment of his life and see a parallel where it's simultaneously happening in the story of Israel. And I would add to that and say, because there's no before or after in God, there is a moment in time, as we experience it, in which God takes on Jewish flesh from his Jewish mother, Miriam. Yeah. But because there's no before or after in time, or no before or after, no time in God, it means that in God, the Son has always been a Jew. Yeah.
It's interesting how you say this, is that it actually harkens back to other cultures, Christian cultures, that weren't so tied to the Aristotelian, linear thinking. Yeah. And one is Celtic Christianity. The Celts often talked about the effects of saints, in later times, that, like, for example, they'll say Saint Bridget was the what do you call it?
Patron saint?
No, the one that helped. I'm having a senior moment here. The one that helped Mary, midwife. Okay, she was a midwife to Mary, and that and you go, this is absurd because Saint Bridget, the historic Saint Bridget, if the historic Saint Bridget exists, is 525 CE, right? But they don't care about that. Yeah. Because they're just saying, no, that's the way God works. Yeah. God works in this way that in a non-historical
a non-linear historical way.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. So what I'm saying is the incarnation is actually eternal, right? Yes. The humanity of the Son is eternal. It's always existed in God. It has not always existed in history, but it's always existed in God, and therefore he is kind of always been in history. So there's a great painting by the Jewish artist from early 20th century Marc Chagall.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen this painting.
No.
It's Yeshua on the cross. As a Jew, he's got his ringlets and he's got his kippah on and everything. On the cross at Mount Sinai, at the giving of the Torah. And this, I think, is deeply, profoundly theologically true. That, in the rabbis, they say that all revelation was given to Moses at Sinai. And in that sense, there's actually no new revelation. It was all given to Moses at Sinai.
Right.
So what's happening on the cross, because the way time works, is actually the cross is also present at Sinai.
Yeah.
And it goes kind of both ways. I look at, for instance, Moses. When he goes up the mountain initially, Mount Sinai, in order to spend time with God and receive the Torah, he comes back down and his face is glowing, right? And they have to put a veil over him because of that.
Yes.
So what other story in the Bible is on top of a mountain with a bunch of light?
Right,
the Transfiguration.
Yeah.
And Moses and Elijah are there, and Moses is on this mountain with Yeshua in the Transfiguration, and he sees all this light.
Yeah.
So what I argue is actually the way time works, when Moses is ascending Mount Sinai, he's actually, in a sense, time traveling. So Moses that's with Jesus isn't Moses resurrected. It's actually Moses from Sinai.
Yeah.
And that's why when he comes back down the mountains, because he's experienced the Transfiguration, and that's why he's glowing.
Yeah.
And so when you look at time that way, and you look at the eternal humanity or the eternal Jewishness of God, in the second person of the Trinity, what it does is it actually undercuts the ability for supersessionism to be true.
Right.
And so in this way, there is no new revelation that can replace the old revelation. There's no coming of the Messiah. The Messiah is already there, right?
Yeah.
He's already present with Israel throughout the entire story.
Yeah, in fact, it kind of works against the idea of having to shove Jesus on Jewish people.
Yeah.
Because you could say, without the name, right? Or without the all of the evangelical replacement that has gone on for so many centuries, we're talking about the same thing. Whenever I talk to Jewish people about this, who can set aside some of the division, or what we call what Walter Brueggemann called the competitive acrimony. I don't see, on either side, either in Christian circles or in Jewish circles, you set aside the competitive acrimony. You go, we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, and then I'll comment on that as well. I would quibble with the way that Brueggemann phrased competitive acrimony, because it makes it as if Jews and Christians have been on equal footing. Yeah. And actually, Jews have been a powerless force, and even now we're a minority, right? In the U.S., we're 5.2% of the population. Even in Israel, people don't know about this, but actually in Israel, we actually are not the majority.
Yes.
In the land of Israel. And within the world population, I think we're 0.2% of the population. We're a very tiny group of people. And throughout history, we have been a small minority oppressed by Christians and Muslims, not just Christians,
or by Babylonians or Assyrians, or
exactly. So,
Persians.
So to say that we have a sense of to imply, as I think he does there, that we have a sense of equal quibble, I think is problematic. It's that Christians have been persecuting Jews and basically trying to shove this replacement theology down our throat and say, well, you need to stop being Jewish, and you need to convert. And what this theology, this non-supersessionist theology does, is it actually says that Yeshua himself is the heavenly Torah, right? In Rabbinic Judaism, there's this concept of the heavenly Torah and the earthly Torah.
Yes.
The earthly Torah is the physical Torah. The heavenly Torah is what comes and makes it present or incarnates into the earthly Torah. Yeshua is the heavenly Torah. And he's the one that gives the earthly Torah to Moses. Actually, Severus of Antioch, the Syriac, he was actually Greek, but he survives in the Syriac tradition and is seen as a church father within the Syriac tradition. He mentions this. He says that the reason why Jesus is besting the Pharisees is because he knows the Torah better than, because he's the one who gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. So if he's the one that gave Moses the Torah at Sinai, if he's always been with Israel, then, and there's only one God, and that God has called the Jews to be faithful to the Torah and its observance, well, that means that if they, in fact, follow the Torah, they are following Yeshua, whether they recognize it consciously or not. This is why I don't believe in proselytizing Jews. I believe in making Jews Torah observant.
Yeah.
Not by force, but by encouragement and so forth. But because they already, salvation, as Yeshua says, is from the Jews, right? He says this in 4:22 to the Samaritan woman. It's from the Jews. It's not from the church. It's actually from the Jews. The church has salvation to the extent that it dwells within the womb of Israel and the Jewish people. And, even John 14:6, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What does this mean? It means a Jew is the way, a Jew is the truth, a Jew is the life, and the Jew is the only way that we come to the Father. And so all of salvation only is mediated through Jewish flesh and blood.
Well, and I think, people use John 14:6 a lot for replacement and also for exclusion, Christian exclusion. And I go, no, if you look at it in context, it's really much more, if you see me, you see the Father. Yeah. When you see the Father, you see me.
And so who do we see by looking at we see the Father by looking at the Jew.
Yeah, right.
Right? And Jesus is never separated from his people Israel. So I attend a conservative synagogue, which is not Messianic Jewish, right?
Yeah.
I'm the only one in there that would be either a Jewish Christian or a Messianic Jew. And I had this vision a few months ago where if you've ever been in a synagogue, right, there's the ark, and in the ark there's the Torah scrolls. Yeah. And so when the ark was opened, I could see all our Torah scrolls, and in the midst of them, I saw Yeshua on the cross, crucified, in the midst of them. And what the important point of this vision is that Yeshua is already present among his people, right? It's not as if he's been separate from among his people this entire time. And oftentimes, we think, well, Jews rejected Jesus. Did we? Did we reject Jesus? Or, as Mark Kinzer, who's a Messianic theologian, says, did we reject a false presentation of the gospel?
Yeah. Well, see, right. I make the argument frequently, is that people who reject Jesus, and that goes for Christians, Jews, but that also goes for Muslims, goes for people of all faiths. The people who reject Jesus are rejecting an image of Jesus that's been forced on them. Yeah. Yeah. And I go, I reject that Jesus too. Yeah. I don't like the evangelical Jesus that's pushed on indigenous people, for example. So I know that a lot of people get uncomfortable with that because they want to have separation. But I mean, really, how is that different, right? Yeah. How is it different to say that to be and it always comes back to, what does being a follower of Jesus mean? Means following the incarnate God. To follow this divine presence. Yeah. And to that point, right? The New Testament and the Old Testament, for that matter, doesn't call for the erasure of distinction, right? Even distinction exists in the Trinity, right? Yeah. It exists in the incarnation, a distinct humanity, a distinct divinity. And the distinct humanity is a Jewish humanity, right? Yeah. If God wanted all peoples to look and act the same, he would have become a universal human blob. Yeah. He didn't. He became a Jew. He became a particular person with a particular ethnic heritage and cultural heritage. And even in the Jerusalem Council, the whole point of the Jerusalem Council was a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, not as a racist distinction that Jews are better than Gentiles, but as a distinction that Jews can, it was assuming Jews can remain Jews, and explicitly stating that Gentiles can remain Gentiles, with a few stipulations, right? Yeah. Not practicing fornication and all that entails, not eating blood, and not strangling animals, and not eating meat sacrificed to idols. But beyond, a few stipulations, God affirms what it means to be Gentile. Yes. Yeah. And a rejection of that, I think, is what leads to Western colonialism, right? This idea that, well, actually everything needs to be universal. Everything needs to look the same. Yes. And you're inferior if you're not. Yes. You're an inferior human being, which colonialism is based on superiority. Yeah. White superiority, European superiority, whatever kind of superiority. Yeah. Christian superiority. Arab superiority, right? Chinese superiority over the Tibetans. It always is. So it's always a separation. It's always saying one person's better than another, and you have to become like me in order to be redeemed, saved, whatever. Yeah. So I want to switch gears here. So you mentioned John 14:6, very misused, very beautiful verse, but very misused and used badly. So that kind of leads into, you were talking in some of your writings about revisioning the Gospel of John, and how we can take this actually very Jewish gospel, right? It's the only gospel that kind of portrays Jesus as a rabbi fully, because he preaches in the various synagogues. He has credentials basically and speaks like a rabbi. And so how do you re-envision John? And how can we look at John, which, says the Jews in there, and how do we look at it differently?
Yeah, so I'll start by telling a story.
Okay.
So my Jewish Christian friend, Lee Spitzer, who's a Jewish Baptist, he grew up in a secular Jewish home out on the East Coast, and his father, however, was secretly a Jewish Christian. But when he was born, his mother made his father promise to keep that from him as a secret. But Lee started to have all these visions, and I want to specify something or note something real quick. The reason why there was such an animus from not sharing his Jewish Christian faith with his son, from the mom's perspective, wasn't because she hated Jesus. Right. It was because Gentile Christians, had been killing and murdering and persecuting and libeling Jews for centuries.
Right. Yeah.
So if you're a people have come in with a shield with a cross on it and says convert or die, then you're going to say, no, my son's not going to be a Christian, right? It's seen as a betrayal, right?
Of course.
It shouldn't have happened that way, but that's how it has happened, and so that was the animus. So, but she makes him promise, and he promises. Lee begins to have mystical visions from the time of a young kid, I think around 6. And if he finds the New Testament, like in his room, incidentally, somehow. He doesn't know, to this day, he doesn't know where it came from.
Yeah.
But he starts reading it. He has more of mystical visions. Eventually, he comes to, I think as a 14-year-old, he comes to faith in Yeshua.
Yes.
And after he does that, he keeps it for a secret for a while. But then he goes and tells his dad, and his dad stands up, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm in so much trouble. My dad's going to be angry.
Right.
And but his dad hugs him and embraces him and says, I'm so happy this happened. I've been praying for this since you were born because your mother made me promise to never share my faith with you.
Yeah.
And after his father died, he asked his mother to read the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
Right? And the Gospel of John is often, and we're going to talk about, often seen as the most anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, supersessionist text, right?
Of the whole
Bible. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so she reads it, and she comes back to him, and she doesn't say much, but what she does say is insightful. She says, "I didn't see any anti-Jewishness in the gospel." Yep. And I think I'm actually going to open I'm writing translating and commentating on a Jewish Christian translation commentary on the Gospel of John, and that's going to be I'm going to have Lee write that story as a preface, because I think the problem with John isn't that it's anti-Jewish, isn't that it's racist toward Jews or supersessionists. It's that Gentile Christians who have been racist towards Jews and supersessionists are reading it. And reading it exclusively from Jews, whether they're Jewish Christians or Messianic Jews or rabbinic Jews. The scriptures, all the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, I prefer to call the faithful witness of Israel. One, because I think oftentimes, for instance, when people argue against an heresy, which is, I would say, a heresy, when people argue against an heresy, they do so using supersessionist framework. Peter Enns is guilty of this, right? Yeah. He does this using a very anti-Jewish, very racist supersessionist framework by saying, well, obviously it's morally corrupt and so forth. That's not the right way to argue against inerrancy. So I do this to say it is the faithful witness of Israel, but it gets away from this inerrancy language and so forth. But also it recognizes that the New Testament was written by Jews too, just like the Old Testament, right? So when we say the Hebrew Bible, in a sense, I think that's a little bit misleading because it kind of implies the New Testament is not Hebrew. It's not Jewish. Right. Obviously, it was written in Greek, but it was written by Jews. And there is a tradition that Matthew, for instance, was originally written in Hebrew. But nonetheless, the faithful witness of Israel is all the Jewish scriptures. And it belongs to Israel. It's actually inseparable from the Jewish people. It is part of us, right? Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book Israel, which is kind of a theological exploration of the land of Israel, he says, in 1967, he relates this story of a friend. Israel was about to be genocided by 6 surrounding Arab nations who were bringing their armies to wipe Israel off the map, to kill all the Jews there. And he was speaking to this with a Gentile friend, and his Gentile friend, well, why are you so sad? Which to me speaks of the most like kind of privilege. What do you mean? Why am I sad? Like my people are about to be wiped out. In 20 years after the Holocaust, what do you mean? Why am I so sad?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he tells them, imagine if there were all the Bibles in the world had been destroyed except one, and then someone reached and grabbed that Bible and threw it into the fire. He says that's what's about to happen. So, interestingly enough, he makes Israel and the Bible synonymous.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. The faithful witness of Israel is inseparable from the people whose witness it is. And so, in a sense, we are actually the stewards of the Scriptures. They don't belong to the church. They don't belong to the Gentile church, at least. They belong to Israel. And the Gentile church, so long as they show gratitude and agree to purge themselves from supersessionism and get permission from Israel, in a sense, through the Messiah and so forth.
Kind of like Timothy.
Kind of like Timothy. Then they can read the Scriptures, and only then can they actually read the Scriptures with knowledge, or with true knowledge. And so John, part of the issue is that Gentile Christians have acted like this as their Scriptures, and they've read it as such. And they've read it as such as if Jews have been replaced and are evil and so forth. So the problem is, I think we need Jewish Christians such as myself, that's why I'm doing this translation commentary, who are starting from the perspective that it's not anti-Jewish, that it isn't supersessionist, and translating it and commentating on it from that perspective. So, for instance, the Greek word eudioi, as you pointed out, is always translated in most texts, in most scriptures, the NRSV, the ESV, lots and lots of translations. Evangelical translations, mainstream translation, Catholic translations. And so when you translate it like that, you come away with this idea from John that John is anti-Jewish and that the Jews are evil, right? And Good Friday, right, when we read, I think it's John 18 and 19, it says the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, right? And actually, that liturgical reading for Good Friday for hundreds of years in Europe served as the incitement to violence towards Jewish communities. They would read those, and then they go out and kill Jews, right? And in a time when anti-Semitism is rising in the last few years, it's dangerous to continue to have to translate it that way. So what I'm doing, I'll give you a few examples. Eudawe is a really flexible word. It can, but it very contextually based, right?
Eudawe is Greek, a Greek for translated as Jews, just in case people don't know that. But it can be translated. Sometimes it should be translated as Jews or Judeans, because Jews. The word Jew comes from the word Judea, which is the land of Judea, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for Judah, the land of Judah, right? Which was the southern kingdom of Israel, and the southern tribe, one of the southern tribes. And so Judea actually is inherently connected to the land of Judea, right? Judea, and so Jew sometimes is the appropriate translation, but again, it's contextually based. So, for instance, in John 4:22, that should be translated as something to the effect of Jews or Judeans, the Jewish people, right? Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, and he says, "We know who we worship, you don't, because salvation is from the Jews," right? And actually, interestingly enough, the "is" there in Greek is actually in the present tense. It's not a past. Salvation was from the Jews. Salvation is from the Jews. Chapter 9:22 about the blind man that Jesus heals. The Pharisees question him, the chief priests and the Pharisees. They say, "Who did this to you?" And he's like, "Well, this guy Jesus. He came up and healed me." And they don't believe him. And so then they bring in his parents and they say, "Was this man born blind?" And they say, "Yeah, he's been born blind. He's been blind his whole life." You say so.
but who as to who healed him, we don't know. The narrator then inserts and says, "They said this for they were afraid of the Eudioi." Most translations translate that as Jews. If you translate it as Jews, then basically we're saying Jews are evil and you need to be afraid of them. Right? Which is where all these ideas of Jews are trying to...
But it's clear, and that's a good point, because in John 9, it's very, very clear that They're talking about Pharisees. They're talking about temple leadership. And I don't know if there's another group in there.
Yeah, specifically the chief priests and the Pharisees.
Yes.
And that's mentioned a few verses earlier. That's who's talking to its parents.
And those and they're fighting between themselves.
Yeah.
The Pharisees and the temple leadership are debating in front of them, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like to just say that those are Jews is ridiculous because even there are more open-minded, you could say maybe Pharisees in the group.
Yeah, and actually aren't. And actually, while the majority of the Pharisees don't follow Jesus in the Gospels, by the time Acts, they've actually been convinced by the resurrection and actually are following him. But what that does when we say fear, right? When we translate it as Jews, which as you rightly pointed out, it's specifically talking about the chief priests and Pharisees. And you would never say, like, if we're talking about,
but not even all Pharisees. Some Pharisees.
Yes.
Even in that story.
Yes, exactly. It's not even all the Pharisees and chief priests, right? Nicodemus is clearly a Pharisee. And there's another, like Joseph Arimathea, right? He's a Pharisee who followed Jesus and actually buries him and pays for his tomb. But in that, I just blanked. In that story, I'm blanking.
You're talking about the blind man story, or are you talking about another one?
I'm still talking about the blind man story.
Yeah,
I'll keep going, see if it comes back to me. But so clearly in that text, it should be translated as just Jews, right?
Yeah.
And if you translate it as just Jews, it gives fodder, in a sense, for this idea that Jews are a people you need to be feared of. And in the medieval period, we've thought about Jews as the devil incarnate, right?
Yeah.
And we still think about Jews as evil incarnate. It's just been secularized.
Right. Well,
right?
Now we do, because we have free Palestine protests around us and things like that.
Yeah. Jews are still evil.
They're still the problem.
They're still the problem. But we just have secularized it, right? Racism towards Jews is the chameleon that's ever changing to adapt its situation, but it's really always the same, right? Origen in the 3rd century, who I love, also he calls them warmongers in the 3rd century. They had no political power at that point. There's no way they could be warmongers. So this idea. But these kinds of ideas are, for instance, that the Jews are trying to control the world, or what, Tucker Carlson and so forth. That comes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this antisemitic literature from Russia. That's rooted in these interpretations of we need to fear the Jews. Why do we need to fear the Jews? Because they're evil, they're nefarious, right? But in that passage, how I translate it is I think I said either Judean religious leaders. I think I said Judean religious leaders, and then in brackets I put chief priests and Pharisees, right? Or, for instance, in John 6, when Jesus does the feeding of the 5,000, and then he begins to say, I am the bread of life who has come down from heaven, and people start grumbling. And the term Judaioi pops up again. It says the Judaioi began to grumble against him, and they said, "Who is this? The son of Joseph and Mary, whom we know? How could he say he came from heaven?" Right. So very clearly, within those couple of verses, it's clear Judaioi should not be translated as Jews. How do they know his mother and father? Because they're from Nazareth. They're Galilean Jews from Nazareth, right?
Kinsmen.
They grew up with him in the same town. They know the snot-nosed kid that crapped his pants as a 6-year-old, And so there I translate it as Galilean Jews from Nazareth, right? So there's a way to, very easily based off the context, figure out how to translate it in a way that is not through this anti-Jewish bias. And I think when we do that, we can begin to, and I would really encourage churches to stop using the NRSV, to stop using the ESV. When we come to pass it, I'm very disappointed in a lot of these translations for not just John, but many verses that are translated in these supersessionist ways. But particularly on John and Good Friday, we do not need to use these translations. And that's part of the reason why I'm trying to do this translation of John, to provide a resource for churches and communities to read.
That's because they take the King James version always. They realize they can't sell Bibles unless it has enough King James in it to be recognizable. So I think that's a lot of it. Especially the NRSV, which is generally excellent, right? And especially updated edition. But
which still translates much of this in a problematic fashion.
And the CEB is an example of where they did try to change some of the wording
Yeah.
when Jesus calls himself Son of Man,
Yeah.
you know, and people get all upset about it,
Yeah.
you know, because they cling so hard
Yeah.
to what the Bible that, you know, they read with grandma, you
Yeah.
know, is. And I go, that's part of the problem we have here, is that what people, you know, were taught in
Yeah.
Sunday school and they grew up with is so supersessionist, so filled with these ideas that I don't know, it's going to take forever
Yeah.
to improve that. You
Yeah.
know?
And but part of that is having translations
Yes.
that we actually read in churches, right? In the Episcopal Church that our official
Yeah.
translation is in RSV.
Yeah.
As a Jew on Good Friday, I have to hear the Jews
Yes.
every year.
Yes.
Which is deeply saddening to me every year. But I do want to point out a couple of translations that actually do a good job.
Okay, yeah,
right?
let
The
us know.
NET
Yes.
actually does a
Yeah.
very good job. I would say mine's better, slightly, just a little bit. But I think it's one of the
Yes.
best out there, particularly when it comes to the Gospel of John.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't just translate as Jews. The TLV, which is a Messianic Jewish translation, that does a better job. The Complete Jewish Bible, which is also a Messianic Jewish translation, also does a better job. Again, I think mine does a slightly better job, but I'm also building off of the work that they've already done. But there are some translations that have tried to move away from
NRSV
that.
UE, which is awesome, is an SBL.
Yeah.
You know, is done by the SBL, and the SBL is dominated by Christians, of course. So you're kind of, it's hard to get away from it. NET is very interesting that you mentioned that, because NET is actually very evangelical.
It is, yeah.
Comes from
Yeah.
the Dallas Theological Seminary,
Yeah.
but you know, it's dominated by that, and it has problems.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
definitely. But I agree with you, is that it handles some of these fallacies much better than others. Yeah.
And to your point about SBL being mostly Christians, I want to say that this isn't a problem that just evangelicals are dealing with. And actually, I know a lot of evangelicals that, because they don't have, which I think is a problem, but because they reject tradition and they just have sola scriptura, they actually sometimes are able to move away from supersession much quickly.
Things. Right? Yeah, good point.
But every denomination, every branch of Christianity is still profoundly supersessionist, whether it's left, right, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, Presbyterian, Episcopalian. You know, I hear Episcopalians say, we're not supersessionism. We've gotten rid of that. And then I'll hear them share the gospel, and they'll skip over the story of Israel. Or, you know, they say things like, well, Jews aren't really, you know, the comfort of upper middle class white Episcopalians on any given Sunday is more important than Jews being murdered. You know, you can't say you're not a supersessionist when you know.
Presbyterians are, you know, usually considered the most intellectual of the, and have, you know, and we tend to think of ourselves as being immune to these things, and of course we aren't. But I think part of the problem is that when you have this intellectualism too, which is based on lots and lots of scholarship, you're carrying a backpack filled with rocks. You're carrying, so that's very interesting that you said that some evangelicals who are very, you know, rejectionists of tradition and scholarship, by the way, too, is they can move away from it easier. Because they don't have this backpack filled with theological rocks that the Presbyterians do.
And I think it's also about self-perception, right? Particularly for a lot of mainstream churches that have statements of, and I want to bring that up in a second, but they have statements officially rejecting supersessionism. I would argue they haven't quite, most of them haven't done much work towards that.
It's still, still in process.
It's like a land acknowledgement, right? We've done a land acknowledgement for the Native Americans, but we really haven't really done it. It's just words. It's just that that's a lot of these supersessionist rejection statements. But there's this idea of self-perception in a lot of these churches because they see themselves on the right side of history, right? So there's not a lot of self-reflection. Oh, evil is out there, right? Evil's not. A.J. Sabota, and he's talking more about secular progressives, but I think it's true for a lot of mainstream, and not just mainstream, but he mentions, you know, I think it was during Black Lives Matter protests, that a lot of the Portland Magazine came out and it said, evil, not in our city, right? And it's this idea that, well, we're on the right side of history, we're morally upright. And you see this with a lot of Gentile Christians who think, oh, anti-Semitism, supersession, My ancestors dealt with that.
Yeah,
Those backwards
yeah.
monkeys. I'm evolved.
Same
right?
argument that people use about slavery and racism.
Yeah,
and stuff.
it's all dead.
It's all gone. I think that one of the ways we can help this situation is by truly engaging with indigenous people and indigenous theologies, because indigenous theologies help us to understand how much of our understanding of indigenous peoples and American history is permeates who we are.
Yeah.
And we have to question a lot of stuff that we aren't willing to question.
Yeah.
So I think that's the same thing with supersessionism, right? So you have to question a lot of stuff that you were taught as a young person or as a child.
Yeah, and even as an adult.
Or as an adult, yes. Or even in your church or your seminary or whatever. So so I do want to switch here. You talked a little bit, and we talked offline a little bit about the Nicene Creed and some of the ideas of... Now, of course, Nicene Creed is the document that all Christians who are Trinitarian take without too much question. I won't say no question. There's always questions, but without too much question. It's not like the Westminster Confession or, which a lot of Reformed people take without question, but they shouldn't, right? Or other creeds. Yeah. So the question here is, when you look at the Nicene Creed, where is it and how is it used as supersession, and how can we look at it a little bit differently to overcome this challenge?
To begin to answer that question, I want to talk about what the Nicene Creed is and what it isn't, and how it is actually, in many ways, pro-Jewish.
Okay.
So the first thing to say is that the Nicene Creed is not a list of propositional statements of truth, right?
Yeah.
It's often treated that way by both people, progressive Protestants and conservative Protestants.
Yes.
This is just propositional statement of truth that we need to give our mental assent to.
Yeah.
If that's how the creed is viewed, that is you're misreading the creed, right?
Yeah.
The creed is actually more of identifying the God that we worship.
Yes.
Right? We worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Creator. We don't worship the God of Arian, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's doing. It's saying this is the God we worship. It's confession of this is the God we worship. Yeah. And it's more about the mystery, protecting the mystery of God, right?
Yes.
That sense of awe that we can't quite name, but we know it's this God, right? So that's what the creed is, first of all, and we need to start from that position. Second of all, the creed is not anti-Jewish in the ways that we often think, right? And it's not imperialist theology. Those would be the two things that I think is
because a lot of people say Nicene Creed is basically Constantine.
Yes.
And
and that it's basically Greek imperial theology, right? I think that's a misconception. And many scholars today of Second Temple and First Temple Judaism recognize the doctrines that are in the creed, such as the incarnation, the Trinity, even, and certainly the resurrection, but obviously the Trinity and the incarnation are actually Jewish doctrines, right? These are doctrines rooted in First and Second Temple Judaism.
Yes.
And so, in that way, what's in the creed is actually from an indigenous, marginalized people in backwards Israel, right?
Yeah.
I say backwards from the position what the Romans thought, right? Not what I think, and so it's not the theology of the Greco-Roman Empire, right? That is trying to Greekify Christianity. It's actually the survival, the reaffirmation of the Jewish DNA of Christianity. The resurrection, the idea of the kingdom, the prophets, creation out of nothing, the resurrection.
I would even say the preservation of the Shema.
Yes, is an expansion of the Shema.
Basically the idea that God is not only spirit, but spirit and body, and mind, and strength, and,
and he's one. God is one, right?
Yes.
Many scholars have recognized this as well. The creed is actually expansion of the Hebrew, the prayer Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Yeah.
The Lord our God is one. He is our God.
Yeah.
And so in all these ways, it's actually quite Jewish. It's preserving the Jewishness. What it doesn't do is it leaves out a lot of things, right? It leaves out in a sense, the story of Israel. So and this is the problem with Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox Christianity at its root is maintaining the Jewish DNA of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
The heretical sects like the Gnostics and the Marcionites, for instance,
Yeah.
they're the ones that are guilty of getting rid of the Jewish DNA.
Yeah, right.
And Greekifying their,
Right.
Greekifying Christianity. They're the Hellenizers. But at the same time, there's this other stream that's counterproductive within Orthodox Christianity that says we want to keep what Israel has given us. We think Israel has been superseded from Israel. God is giving us the covenant and the promises and the scriptures and all the things that go along with it. It belongs to us now. And at the same, so we want to keep it. We don't want to get rid of it like the Marcionites. But at the same time, we want to exclude the Jewish people.
Right.
But the reason why this is counterproductive is because the Jewish people can't be separated from these things. The
Yes.
covenant is actually what makes the Jewish people
Who
a
they are.
people.
Yeah.
Right? And this is why, in the incarnation, the covenant and its promises are actually inseparable from his humanity. So if you deny the promises or the covenant more generally, you actually can't affirm the full humanity of the Son. And so these are inseparable. Because they're inseparable, to exclude the Jewish people is to exclude the Jewishness, all the foundation, the covenant, and all these things. And so there's actually these two streams within Orthodox Christianity pushing against one another.
Right.
And once we get rid of the supersessions, we can actually reaffirm, the Orthodox theology. We can more deeply affirm Orthodox theology than the Church Fathers. But that being said, so part of the thing, and I've written a Nicene Creed, which is an expansion. I haven't taken anything away, but I've added what I think should be in there, and I've begun to
help explain.
I've begun to explain why I think the things I've added should be in there. In the International Christian Embassy, which I gave a talk at on this topic at their conference, the Jerusalem Summit, they are actually proposing and are in the process of amending the Nicene Creed to propose to the church worldwide. And so we need to we can't skip over the story of Israel, right? We need to recognize this is integral to the Christian theology. The Christian theology is only Christian theology when it's attached to its Judaism.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
So I think, that and that's interesting too, is that if you look at the project of, of course, I'm looking at it as a Christian pastor in the 21st century, but I look at the project of an expanding God, of a God that, regional, Yahweh, one of the Baals, a lot of people think, and how in incarnation, in Moses, in the Davidic covenant, in the new covenant, whatever that is, the expansion. So, the Nicene Creed was meant to be that way too, was to take all these various groups that were fighting, cats and dogs, right? And it wasn't so much to reject the Arians, which it had to because of
they worshipped a different God.
It's the same thing as homoousis and homoiousios, right? Is this idea of is Jesus subordinate? We actually even talked about that offline a little bit, and I can talk about it on another episode. Is the idea of the eternal subordination of the Son, the idea that Jesus is not begotten, and so forth. So I think that's a great way of looking at of this integration. Is that your goal with this? Is to have sort of this integration of the Jewish understanding, the Shema understanding of who God is?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I guess you could say my project is an undoing of the parting of the ways. It's a healing, a restitching of the parting of the ways. So the parting of the ways, for those who don't know, is what scholars call the separation between Christianity and Judaism, right?
Yeah.
In the first century, most Christians were Jews. They didn't see themselves as anything but Jews.
Yes.
Following Yeshua, he was the Jewish Messiah of Israel, bringing redemption to Israel.
Yes.
Gentiles following the Messiah was an oddity. It's not that it was unexpected. They knew it was. The scriptures clearly talk about this.
Yes.
And even in the calling of Abraham, the point of his calling, to be a blessing to the nations.
But it's still hard to do.
It's still hard to do. How do we knew about this. How do we implement it?
Yeah.
That was the struggle.
Yeah.
And but in that, I just lost my train of thought. But what was I talking about?
You were talking about. I don't know.
Oh, that's okay. But so So they understood themselves as Jews.
Yeah.
Right.
But
it was trying to figure out what to do with the Gentiles. But so in the beginning, it took 5 centuries. Daniel Boyer and the Jewish Talmudic scholar talks about it took 5 centuries for Christianity and Judaism really to become 2 separate religions, right?
Yeah.
And even religion is really kind of a Christian category. It's really not a Jewish category either. Being Jewish is a people rooted in the land of Israel that's part of a way of being. The Torah is a way of being, right?
In fact, I would say that it's probably not even until Pope Gregory when you really had the consolidation of Catholicism and definition of Catholicism being the one true. You know, before that, the idea of Catholicism being the one true. Roman Catholic Church. But the Roman Church being the one true only Christianity really didn't kind of exist until the dominance.
Yeah, I would say I would probably make the case till the 14th century, somewhere around the 14th century.
Well,
14.
I mean, because then you had Anselm and you had, and part of it's a reaction.
Well, but particularly because of the Council of Florence, and I think that was in the 15th century, which was the last council between the East and the West, so-called, which became the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. Yeah. That's really where the split between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic came, and therefore the birth of the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. I would say they didn't exist before then, to the chagrin of my Orthodox and Catholic friends. But,
of course.
But the parting, get back to the parting of the ways, the parting of the ways is therefore, quote unquote, the separation of Judaism and Christianity. And what I'm trying to do is to show, and to do so as a constructive theological project, to show that they're not separate. Yeah. They were never separate. The idea that they are separate is phenomenological, meaning experientially, because of history, it appears so. But theologically, in reality,
we're pointing in the same direction.
Not even that we're pointing in the same direction, that we are both a part of the same religion and a twofold nature, right? Yeah. This is called, Mark Kinzer calls this bilateral ecclesiology, right? We worship the same God. We are both, whether we recognize it or not, as I would say, we are both following Yeshua because he is the Torah. And therefore, but we're meant to keep our distinction. Right, Gentiles and Jews are meant to keep their distinction, and more particularly Gentiles and their various ethnic heritages are meant to keep their distinction. Those aren't meant to be erased. But so showing that really Christianity is a kind of Gentile Judaism, and it's not really separate. So that that would overall be my project, and therefore I'm working on getting rid of all the replacement theology, right, and showing not just what it isn't, but what it is, right? As a constructive, not just a deconstructive project. So,
well, in fact, I would say that that's the one thing I've learned personally in the last few months, actually, in studying Romans really carefully. Is I go, boy, if you can read Romans without this lens of supersessionism, you can see it much more gracious, open. Big, beautiful, and it's just one small example of many where, and as I was mentioning to Beverly Gaventa, this idea of if we can see the Hilasterion as a place of presence, as she calls it, the place of presence of God, rather than the substitutionary atonement, which is how it's been translated. That it's not a substitutionary atonement that Christians have invented. It's the presence with. And rather than the replacement of. If we can get to that point, boy, there's so much opportunity for healing, for ecumenism, for people to not be as colonialist and racist as they are, things like that.
And I'll add to that, Matthew 26 and 27, right? Particularly the passage where the crowd is standing before Jesus and Pilate says, basically, I wash my hands of his blood. And they say, let his blood be on us and our children. That is read through a supersessionist lens and an anti-Jewish lens more broadly.
As blood libel.
Is a blood libel, right? That we are guilty, that we can never get the stain of his blood off of us because Jews killed Jesus, right? But actually, if you're reading Matthew like that, you're not reading it in its scriptural context, right? But if you're reading the Old Testament as it has exegetical priority, then you look back at the Old Testament and say, where do we see blood being sprinkled on people? At the affirmation of the covenant, right? So in Exodus 24, Moses slaughters a calf, which actually the calf was actually the animal representation of the God of Israel.
Yeah.
And this continues, like in the book of Enoch, we see this. Origen talks about God, the Messiah, being represented as a calf.
Yeah.
So in Exodus 24, Moses slaughters a calf, takes the blood, sprinkles it on the altar, and he sprinkles it on the people and on their descendants. And he says, this is the ratification of the blood of the covenant. So when Yeshua at the Last Supper, he says, take this is the blood of my covenant, which actually some manuscripts don't say new covenant, just says covenant. This is the blood of my covenant. And then later they say, let his blood be on us and on our descendants. It's a hearkening back to Moses. They are being sprinkled with the blood that actually causes death to pass over, because Yeshua's death is a Passover death. Right. And so during the Passover, God said, slaughter a lamb, which he's also called the Passover lamb. Yes. Slaughter a lamb, take the blood of the lamb, smear it over a doorpost, so when death passes over, it'll pass over you, hence Passover. So this is what's happening. Pilate is washing himself for protection of salvation, and death is going to, and actually he was killed a few years later. Yeah. And the people, by having his blood sprinkled on them, they're actually saved.
Salvation doesn't come from imperial power.
Yeah.
Salvation comes from protection and presence of God. So, so with that, I think we can wrap up. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this? And give some,
we hinted at this idea of this connection between colonialism and supersessionism. So I'm just going to briefly mention this. And I wrote a chapter recently on land because I think oftentimes we think, well, God only gives Israel land. But as my professor Randy, and our professor Randy Woodley once said, everyone's indigenous from somewhere. Yes. Right? The Jews are indigenous to Israel, but everyone's indigenous to somewhere. And the Jewish tradition actually explicitly, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, says that God gives gifts of land allotment to all people. So Deuteronomy 32:8 says that when God divided the nations of the world, he set their boundaries. Yeah. Right? In the book of Jubilees, which is one of the earliest Jewish commentaries on Genesis, in Exodus, has this story of Noah and his sons coming off the ark. And when they come off the ark, they draw lots to determine, which drawing lots in biblical times was an idea of discerning, way to discern God's will. Yes. So they draw lots to determine the dividing of the lands to all their sons and grandsons, right? To all the different peoples of the world. And after they do so, after they get their land allotments, and it goes through each of the sons and their grandsons and says who gets what. The children of Israel get the land of Canaan, for instance. But it goes through, and then all of them say, we swear on oath that we will stick to our land allotment. We won't transgress the borders, right? And then they put a curse on themselves. And if we do transgress these borders given to us by God, we will be cursed. Right? And this is actually written during the Greek colonial occupation of Israel in the 2nd century, around the Maccabean period. So it's an anti-colonial, anti-imperial text saying that God actually gives people's land. The Greek nation is cursed because it has transgressed their borders and come into Israel. And there's lots of things like this. But to say that supersessionism, what it does, and what we see in the early church is this kind of form of land supersessionism. Israel has been kicked out of the land. They're no longer recipients of the land promise. Now the church is. The church has been replaced, has replaced Israel.
Now the church are the new chosen people, basically. Yeah. And
so now the land promise is theirs, and Jews are forced to scatter, wandering the earth for the rest. That's their punishment, their curse, right? This, which happens in the early church, is the ideological setting up for Western colonialism. Yeah. Because if you become the new people of God, and when you come into a new land, what are you going to do? You're going to replace them, right? This is the old people, the old people of Israel. We're the new people of Israel. And this is how it was framed when they came into Turtle Island, and they took indigenous land here. Is they said, well, this is the old Israel. And it says, we are the new Israel.
And behind it is, I'm better than you. Yeah. We are better people. We are God's people. Yeah. And we're, So let us wrap up then. Yeah. And I just, as I always say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really true there. and that is, I think, the realization that we just talked about is that supersessionism is not in the Bible. Yeah. It is made by Christians.
Yeah, Gentile Christians in the 2nd century.
Yes. And continued and grew and grew and grew and grew. So with that, thank you so much, Gabe, and always wonderful to speak with you.
Yeah.
And I hope that you all learned a little bit like I did. And thanks be to God for you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.